Good evening. I'm Steve Weberg of the Kansas City Public Library, and I'd like to welcome and thank you for joining us tonight. 4 days, 23 hours, and just about 30 minutes from kickoff of Super Bowl 56 in Inglewood, California. Super Bowl without the Chiefs, who'd have thunk it? Funny thing, in the run up to what's annually the biggest, most analyzed and hyped game on the planet, actually not so funny thing, we haven't been deluged to this point with gushing stories about Joe Burrow, the wonderkin Bengals quarterback who beat the Chiefs a couple of Sundays ago, or about the pressure he's likely to get from the Rams and one of the best defensive front sevens in the NFL. The dominant headlines have been off the field, and they aren't gushing. The NFL has a racial equity problem. Brian Flores says so in a class action lawsuit filed last week against the league and three of its teams. He'd been fired as the Miami Dolphins coach after back-to-back winning seasons and didn't, as he saw it, get a fair shot at any of the other 8 head coaching jobs filled the past few weeks. In his suit, he says, quote, "Rules have been implemented, promises made, but nothing has changed." And he calls the NFL, quote, "in certain ways, racially segregated and, quote, managed much like a plantation." Now, the league's commissioner, Roger Goodell, admits there's a problem, saying the league's failure to add diversity to its head coaching ranks is unacceptable, his word. And indeed, the numbers are stark. If in a league in which 70% of the players are Black or other minorities, only 2 head coaches are Black and a total of 5 are minorities. Now, of course, John Feinstein, one of the best sports journalists on the planet, was in front of this story. His latest book, Raise a Fist, Take a Knee, Race and the Illusion of Progress in Modern Sports, came out in November. It lays out the decidedly mixed record of success that sports, and not just the NFL, but also Major League Baseball, big-time college football and basketball, and other pro sports, have had in promoting and especially in achieving racial equity. Baseball, 30 teams, 2 Black managers, and just 1 Black executive running a team baseball operations. College football's top division, the one in which Alabama and Ohio State and Missouri and Kansas play, 130 programs in which 60% of the players were Black or other minorities this past season, but well more than 80% of the head coaches were white. Same for the people who hired those coaches. More than 81% of the athletic directors at those schools were and are white. Of course, there's also the pushback against players who might dare to take a stand. We saw that 6 years ago when more than 24 football players at the University of Missouri threatened to sit out over the schools and the university system's handling of racist incidents on campus. Their coach, Gary Pinkel, supported them. Many others did not. Then LeBron James told to shut up and dribble. Colin Kaepernick is out of football. John, whom I'm fortunate to call a friend and a former colleague, is with us tonight to talk about his book and about the fact that the issues of racial discrimination and inequity plaguing society at large do not spare sports. They haven't in the past. They still don't now. Joining John in the conversation is Jay Adande, another old friend who directs the sports journalism program at Northwestern's renowned Medill School of Journalism, Media, and Integrated Marketing Communications. When I first talked to John a little while back about tonight, about a program revolving around his book, the first thing he said was, "This is the most important book I've written," which for John is saying something. He's written 45 books, including 2 of the most acclaimed and best-selling sports titles of all time, A Season on the Brink and A Good Walk Spoiled. John's a longtime writer and columnist for the Washington Post. He's contributed to many other national outlets, both print and broadcast, and is a member of 5, count them 5, halls of fame, including the National Sports Writers and Sportscasters Hall of Fame and the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame as the winner of its Kurt Gowdy Award. Jay has headed Northwestern sports journalism program since 2016 and is also an accomplished sports journalist, including 10 years as a columnist for the Los Angeles Times and as a writer at the Washington Post alongside John and the Chicago Sun-Times. You may recognize Jay from his more than 1,000 appearances on ESPN's roundtable discussion show Around the Horn. Now, if you have a question over the course of their discussion, and we hope you do, you can submit it via the YouTube live chat box, and we'll get as many answered as we can at the end of the presentation. John, Jay, it's great to see you again, and it's great to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us, and welcome to both of you. Jay, I'll let you get things started.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's great to see you again. It's great to be reunited with the two of you. And I appreciate that you thought of me for this discussion. Certainly, these are topics that I've always felt are important. Really, one of the reasons I got into sports journalism is to help tell the stories beyond the field and beyond the arena, and to look at the interaction of sports and society. And John has certainly taken on that challenge most specifically in this book. And John, of all the multitude of books, everyone starts with the same thing, and that's an idea, right? So what was the idea and the motivation behind this book at this time?
Well, Jay, first of all, thanks for doing this with me. I'm grateful to you for taking the time, and I think we're both grateful to Steve for reaching out to us. My history with race and sports really goes back to when I was in college. I grew up in New York City. I played ball all the time in my neighborhood with white kids, black kids, and Hispanic kids. And the only thing that mattered, and I'm sure you experienced this as a kid too, was could you play? It didn't matter what race you were or what your ethnic background was. But when I got to Duke, it was a lot different, politically and in every possible way. And my junior year, Duke played a football game at Army, and Duke back then, as now, was lousy in football. And so the Durham Morning Herald, the local paper, I was starting to do some stringing work for them, working for them as a non-staffer at times. And they asked me to cover the Duke Army football game, which I was thrilled. I got paid $50 to write a lead and a sidebar. And that was huge money. And Duke rallied in the second half to win the game when they brought in a freshman quarterback named Mike Dunn. And I wrote about Mike Dunn coming in to save the game. And then I wrote my sidebar on him and how Duke had recruited him and the high hopes they had for him. He turned out to be a very good college player and was very happy with myself. I made deadline, flew home with the team, picked up the paper the next morning, excited to see 2 bylines. And when I got to the part where I introduced Mike Dunn in the lead, it said Duke black freshman quarterback, Mike Dunn. And I was like, what? I mean, Duke had black linebackers, black running backs, black wide receivers, black everything. Dunn was the first black quarterback at Duke. This is 1975. And so I called the editor who had edited the 2 stories because he put it in the sidebar too. And I said, what are you doing here? What difference does it make what color he is? And he said, John, he's the first black quarterback Duke's ever had. That's part of the story. And the funny thing, I was furious. And the funny thing was, when I was working on this book, and I was talking to Doug Williams, who, as you know, wrote the foreword, first black quarterback to ever win a Super Bowl. And I go way back with Doug. And I told him that story, and he laughed at me. And he said, boy, were you naive. Of course they were going to put that in the story. And so that was kind of my first experience with dealing with the fact that race is always there in one form or another. And then in 2010, there were other incidents, and I've obviously known a lot of black athletes and black coaches through the years. But in 2010, Donovan McNabb came to play quarterback here in Washington. And in the 8th game of the season against the Detroit Lions, he'd taken every snap. And Washington fell behind 30-25 at the 2-minute warning. And they took the kickoff, and Rex Grossman, the immortal Rex Grossman, who you with your Chicago background probably remember, because he did take the Bears to the
Super Bowl, their last Super Bowl.
Which is proof that Lovie Smith is a great coach. But Rex Grossman came in. He hadn't taken a snap all season, like I said. First play, he was strip sacked by Ndamukong Suh, picked the ball up, ran into the end zone, game over. So after the game, Shanahan was asked, what made you change quarterbacks? And he could have said, look, I had a gut feeling about Rex. He could have said Donovan wasn't having a great game, which he wasn't. But instead, he said, well, I didn't know if Donovan knew our 2-minute offense. This is an 11th year NFL quarterback midway through the season, and he didn't know the 2-minute offense? Well, that answer really didn't sit well with a lot of the media. So the next day he was asked it again. This time he said, I didn't know if Donovan was in shape to run back-to-back plays. Wow. So this simmered for a week. Washington was off the next week. It was a bye week, their bye week. And Chris Mortensen, who you know well and who I know well, reported on ESPN that weekend that the Shanahans, according to sources, it was anonymous, according to sources, the Shanahans had to cut their playbook in half for McNabb. Now, this is a guy who's taken a team to the Super Bowl. He's been a Pro Bowl quarterback. I think the Eagles had made the playoffs 7 times in his 10 years there. And now in a week, he's been called out of shape, not prepared, and finally, anonymously, dumb by his coaches. Now, you knew where it came from. It came from one of the Shanahans, either Mike or Kyle. So the next day, I went on a TV show that I think you were on through the years, Washington Post Live. And I attacked Mike Shanahan. I said, this is racial coding. This goes back to the 60s and 70s when people claimed that blacks weren't smart enough to play the quarterback position. And what was most fascinating about it, Jay, was how I was attacked in the Washington media in particular, but also the national media. I was accused of playing the race card, which is what happens often when you bring up race as an issue. As Tony Dungy likes to say, when I bring up race as an issue, people say, why are you making race an issue? And my answer is because it is an issue. And of course, he's 100% right. So that simmered with me until the anthem protests in 2017, when Colin Kaepernick was clearly blackballed out of the league. And yet most of the NFL media was writing stories, quoting sources as saying, oh, no, he wasn't blackballed. He's just not good enough anymore. He was 29 years old. He'd been the starting quarterback for the 49ers the year before, the last 11 games of the season. And all of a sudden, he's not good enough to be at the top 64 quarterbacks in the league. But they duly reported it. And then during the anthem protest, after Donald Trump's rant, whenever players were kneeling, most black, fans were booing, most white. And I thought, wow, we are really polarized in this country right now, racially. And I went to see John Thompson, who I had known since I first got to the Post, when he was in the middle of his Hall of Fame career at Georgetown. And we'd fought for much of that time.
Legendary fights.
Some of them were pretty legendary, including the time when I was stupid enough to offer to go outside with him and figure things out that way, which would not have worked out well for me. Fortunately, he laughed at me and refused the offer. But Jan had become kind of a mentor to me in many ways after he retired, because he was so damn smart. And I went and I said to him, I want to do a book on race in sports, but I don't know where to start. And he said, you might as well try to explain the Holy Trinity. And then he pointed a finger at me and he said, which is why you have to do it. But I still didn't have a way in. The next year, I found the way in, which was Lamar Jackson, who, as you remember, when he came out of college, was told, become a wide receiver, become a running back. Your skills aren't right for an NFL quarterback. 4 white quarterbacks were drafted in the top 10 that year. One of them, Josh Allen, has become a star. Baker Mayfield's okay. And Josh Rosen is on like his 4th team already. And Sam Darnold has failed both with the Jets. No surprise to me as a lifelong Jets fan. and with the Carolina Panthers. Lamar Jackson went with the last pick in the first round, and not coincidentally was chosen by Ozzie Newsome, who was the first black general manager in the NFL. Well, we all know what's come to pass. Lamar was the unanimous MVP in his second year in the league. When he got hurt this year, the Ravens fell apart completely. They never won another game after he got injured. He's one of the at worst, one of the, 4 or 5 best quarterbacks in the NFL. And yet all these experts, the scouts, the pundits on TV, Bill Polian, I'm not picking on him, but he just happens to be a Hall of Famer who was on TV at the time, all said he shouldn't be a quarterback. Steve Young was very fast. Fran Tarkenton was very fast. No one ever suggested they change positions. If Lamar Jackson was the exact same player and he was white, no one would have ever suggested he change positions. So that was my way into the book.
I want to go back to that story you told about the Duke Army game and seeing words added to your lead. I'm wondering what you learned about how, and from your subsequent or your more recent conversation with Doug Williams about that, about how in some cases, Black people want the race to be included. It's not a sidebar when Lamar Jackson is the MVP, that there's significance, that the racial component of that is significant. When Patrick Mahomes wins a Super Bowl MVP, the racial component of that is significant. Right. How did you become aware of that? And maybe how did you come to incorporate that in your writing?
Well, it's funny because I went and talked to Mike Dunn after that happened. We were fellow students and I apologized to him. And Mike said, don't worry about it. I understand why they did it. I mean, he's a very bright guy. And you make a good point that when the first time I interviewed Doug Williams when he was in Tampa, I know this became kind of a famous story at the Super Bowl later, but I apologized to him because we were about a year late getting down there, we being the Washington Post. He was in his second year by the time George Solomon sent me down to write a story about him. And by then, the Bucs had gotten good and they went to the playoffs that year. They actually went to the NFC Championship game. But when I sat down with Doug, I said, I'm really sorry to make you answer all these questions again. And he looked at me, he said, John, I've been a black quarterback all my life. So fire away and don't worry about it. And, when people reference white guilt, I think sometimes I probably have some of that, but it's for good reason. There's reason for us to feel guilty about the way Blacks have been treated in this country for 400 plus years now, but also in sports. And Leonard Hamilton, the Florida State basketball coach who grew up with Jim Crow in Charlotte, North Carolina, said to me, look, for any of us to say progress hasn't been made is stupid. I mean, I grew up with white-only water fountains and having to sit in the balcony at the movies and dealing with that throughout my boyhood. And obviously that's totally different now. He said, but there are people, many of them, 74 million people voted for Donald Trump a little more than a year ago, who want to believe that because there's no Jim Crow, because there are voting rights laws, although now that some of them are basically being repealed, it's okay. We don't have to worry about race anymore. Well, that's just not true, as we all know. It's the fact that Steve mentioned the Brian Flores case. It's 2022. Jackie, it'll be 75 years since Jackie Robinson made his debut in Brooklyn come April. And we're still dealing with some of the same stuff, Jay. I mean, you know that. You live with it every day.
Look at Black participation in Major League Baseball, right? I mean, it peaked in the 70s into the mid 80s. And
now it's down to 8. It was down to 6%. It's now come back up to 8%.
About half of where it was about 40 years ago. Yeah,
it was almost 20% at that point. And part of it is just the way our society has changed. Kids want to play basketball. They want to play baseball. They don't want to football. They don't want to play baseball as much. You don't see kids. When I was a kid, we played in the schoolyard or in the park every single day when the weather was warm. And now you don't necessarily see that. When the weather's warm, you see a lot of kids playing basketball. But again, MLB has not done a great job. And then now they say, everybody now says, Steve quoted Roger Goodell as saying, well, this situation with coaches and general managers is, quote, unacceptable. Okay, we had 3 black coaches in the NFL last year. Now we have 2 plus someone who's biracial and identifies as black. So the number of black coaches has actually gone down when it was already brutally low. And for a long time, for the last month, we only had 1 black coach in the NFL, and that was Mike Tomlin. And he still has a job because he's going to the Hall of Fame. Well, it's kind of hard to fire him at this point. I asked both Mike and Tony Dungy, who I leaned on both of them heavily in my reporting, as you can tell in reading the book. Why wouldn't Roger Goodell talk to me? Because I've known Goodell since he first got the job, and I always got along fine with him, and I was turned down flat. I interviewed every other major commissioner, turned down flat to interview Goodell. And ironically, the day they put out the statement when Flores sued them, it was almost word for word the email that I got from Brian McCarthy, the NFL's PR guy, on why Roger wouldn't speak to me. The NFL, Roger's very busy trying to promote diversity and blah, blah, blah. And so I said to Tomlin and Tony Dungy, why wouldn't he talk to me? And they both said the same thing. He's embarrassed. I don't think Roger Goodell's a bad guy, right, but he's
not the problem here.
He can't tell the owners what to do because they're paying him $44 million a year.
So Doug Williams wrote the foreword to the book, and in it he said, if this book were to be written by someone who is black, a lot of people would shrug and say, it's just another black guy whining. So I'm wondering how you took advantage of your whiteness to write this book, how that came into play, starting with, do you think it could have been published if you were not white?
Well, that's a very good question, and I don't know the answer to that. But both Kevin Blackistone and Michael Wilbon, who you know well, you know them both well, said to me when I talked to them early in my reporting that it was better that this book was being written by a white guy. And there are going to be some guys out there who say, one of the publishers who turned down the idea, there were 5 publishers who turned it down, said, how can you write a book about race when you're white? And I said, well, white is a race, isn't it? And I've written books about being a college basketball coach without ever being one. I've written books about playing golf on the PGA Tour. God knows I've never been on the PGA Tour. So as Doug said, as I said in the book, I don't pretend that I know what it's like to be black. I've never been pulled over for DWB, driving while black. When I'm pulled over, it's usually because I deserve it. But every single person I interviewed, and I'm guessing that you'd be right in there, Jay, has been pulled over at some point for driving while black. And of course, the exception of that story was Cullen Jones, the Olympic swimmer, who literally was stopped by a cop while walking his dog because the cop was convinced he had somehow stolen the dog. And I said to Cullen, you're the first guy I've interviewed who was stopped for WDWB, walking dog while black. And so, but I went into the book knowing that I can't empathize with what it's like to be black, but I can certainly sympathize because of all the people I've known and because of all the people I got to interview for this book. And you would be amazed the number of people, no, you probably wouldn't be amazed, but many of the people I interviewed thanked me for wanting to do the book for the exact same reason that Wilbon and Blackistone said, it's better that you're doing it because you're white. They like the fact that even though I can't understand what it's like to be black, that I was trying to explain what it's like to be black.
John, in my case, it was RBWB, riding bicycle while black.
There you go.
That's what got me pulled over and got a gun pointed at me as well in Georgetown when I was an intern at the Washington Post.
Well, you can't be a black guy in Georgetown.
We talk about coaching and where do we stand now? And in particular, why aren't we seeing the advancement? I want to stop and, we criticize the numbers, but I feel like we don't do a good enough job of praising when the right thing is done. And if you look at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they've had 3 black head coaches in their history. And They just won the Super Bowl last year with a staff that Bruce Arians very purposefully had filled out with Black coordinators at all the three major coordinating positions, in addition to 2 female coaches. When he'd had one in Arizona, he decided, you know what, let's not just do one, let's do 2. So we very purposely built this diverse staff, wins a Super Bowl with it, and yet it doesn't lead to any wave of hiring, right? We had those same coaching staff in the semifinals of the NFL playoffs. We have Leslie Frazier, right? You know, Raheem Morris. Like we've got all these coaches succeeding in the playoffs, and of course Eric Bieniemy. And why hasn't this success now? Why haven't the people who have shown you can do it increased and created some type of copycat around the league?
Well, and that's a great point, and it's one that Tony Dungy made to me. He said the notion that there are not qualified guys out there is so far out of line right now, because clearly there are plenty of qualified Black coaches out there. And I think, you know, some of it gets back to the very simple fact that there are 31 NFL owners. The Packers are owned by the city, basically, or fans. But 31 NFL owners, 30 of them are white. And interestingly, the owner in Jacksonville, who grew up in Pakistan, has never hired a Black coach or general manager. And we see how well that's worked out for him in recent years, especially this past year. But you're talking about people, and this isn't unique to the NFL. It's also true in college, big time college sports. It's true, as you mentioned, in Major League Baseball. And it's true in the NBA, although the NBA has had so much success. So many Black coaches have had success in the NBA dating back to Bill Russell with the Celtics, because the NBA was so far ahead of the curve, thanks in large part to Red Auerbach. But white guys look at somebody sitting in their office and they're just more comfortable with somebody who looks like them. And a lot of these are old white billionaires who don't want anybody, are used to nobody telling them what to do, are used to people telling them they're right no matter what they do. And so, and they're, you know, I felt before the Flores lawsuit, and before I think there were people on the phone saying to Houston and to Miami, there were only 3 jobs left open at that point. The other one was New Orleans. Hey, we got to hire a Black coach or 2 or all hell is going to break loose. I felt like before that, when the Flores was fired the day after the NFL season ended, and a lot of people, myself included, attacked Steve Ross and attacked the NFL for the fact that, and there's empirical evidence of this, that Black coaches have a shorter leash. Not only is it harder to get hired, it's harder to avoid being fired. Lovie Smith was fired in Chicago after he'd gone 10-6.
Yeah, Jim Caldwell followed with the winning record in Detroit.
Yeah, with Jim Caldwell had the best record of any Lions coach who'd been there at least 4 years in 60 years. Wow. And they fired him. How have they done since then? You know, that's really gone well for them, hasn't it? But I felt like some of the owners just dug in and said, we're not going to let anybody in the media or anybody else tell us what to do or who to hire. And the first 6 hires in this hiring cycle were all white. And I'm not saying any of them are unqualified. I'm not, and the whole Bill Belichick text thing with Brian Flores kind of sums up who these owners are. And John Mara is supposed to be one of the distinguished guys. You know, he's no Dan Snyder. And yet there was Belichick accidentally congratulating Flores for getting the Giants job 3 days before he was interviewed, and when Brian Daboll had apparently already been hired. So what kind of interview was that?
Exactly. We have a question from the audience asking, what do you make of Eric Bieniemy's situation? The fact that he hasn't landed a head coaching job, is it discrimination, pure and simple? Is it more nuanced? And you talked to Tony Dungy for the book about Bieniemy's situation. So what do you make of it?
Well, as you know, Tony Dungy is hardly a jump on the table and shout guy. He's very low key, always wants to hear both sides of a question. And when I was sitting at his dining room table, and I said, So Eric Bieniemy, and before I could finish the question, he said, now that was racism. And this was 2 years ago. This was 2 hiring cycles ago. And he said, there's absolutely no reason for Eric Bieniemy to not have a job based on what he has accomplished. He's running the best offense in football, and he still is. The Chiefs' loss aside, in the conference championship game. And as I said, I think before we got started, I mentioned that when I interviewed Eric Bieniemy for the book, he was bright, he was smart, he was funny, he was a storyteller. He clearly had a great memory. He recited to me a poem that the coaches, or a chant, excuse me, that his coaches in New Orleans, when he was 10 years old, made the kids recite at the end of practice every day about drugs. So the notion that he hasn't gotten a job because he doesn't interview well is ridiculous. And then there's the excuse that, well, he doesn't call the plays. Well, neither did Matt Nagy, neither did Doug Peterson, who won a Super Bowl. And when he was an assistant coach, neither did Andy Reid. And if I'm being repetitive, forgive me, but there's no reason for Eric Bieniemy not to have a job. There's no reason for Byron Leftwich not to have a job. I mean, these are bright young coaches. Eric's not that young anymore, but Leftwich certainly is. And it seems like everybody now wants to hire the next Sean McVay. That they want to hire a guy who's white in his 30s and has a little bit of a beard. Doesn't shave every day. And look, Sean McVay's a terrific coach, second Super Bowl on Sunday. But that shouldn't be the role model for who you're hiring. The role model should be, how good have you been as an assistant, or how good were you as a head coach? Bill Belichick failed in his first job as a head coach, and clearly there were circumstances that prevented him from succeeding in Cleveland, because he's certainly done pretty well in New England. Just because you get fired once doesn't mean you should never get another chance. Although Willie Randolph in baseball had a winning record with the New York Mets, completely turned them around from 71 wins to 97 wins in 2 years, got fired, and that was 13 years ago, and he's never gotten another job. Whereas white managers get recycled every day in baseball.
I can't think of the last time I heard Willie Randolph's name before you just mentioned it right here. Let's switch to the NBA for a moment, because the NBA does have a better record if you look at the numbers, and it no longer seems like news when a black coach gets hired in the NBA. And yet, how many of the better jobs go to black coaches? I also want to I want to point that out there. We've had, in recent years, black coaches, Tyronn Lue, Doc Rivers, but it's still somewhat infrequent when you look at the list and the history of black coaches who have won championships in the NBA, despite we're seeing a pretty representative number throughout the league right now. Some of those coaches have won championships, guys like Steve Kerr and Greg Popovich that you spoke to. What did you learn from them about how a white coach can succeed in a league that is predominantly black? What is their key to success in that regard?
Well, I think when you mention Kerr and Popovich, you're talking about two guys who really understand as much as a white guy can, what it's like to be black. Both of them told me, Steve in particular, but both of them told me that the George Floyd thing changed their outlook. And these are guys who had pretty good outlooks on the issue beforehand, but they both said, my God, I don't know enough about what's going on in this country.
Really, given all that, that's pretty stunning to me, that given the amount of time they spent, and I would say the interest that they take, right, in the lives and the interests and the concerns of their black players, and yet they still, after all that time, felt like they didn't know enough.
They needed to know more. And Mike Krzyzewski was the same way. He actually did Zoom calls with every former black player, all his former players, but many of them black, to try to learn more, to try to understand the frustrations, because he felt he didn't understand the frustrations. And that's why he did the Black Lives Matter video that he did, which if you haven't seen it, it's 2 minutes and 47 seconds. And it's really passionate. And he told me he didn't write anything. He asked Nolan Smith, former player, one of his assistants, to stand next to the camera. And he spoke to Nolan Smith and said, "This is how I feel." And Popovich actually said he had his first experience with understanding when he was in college at the Air Force Academy. And they were playing in North Carolina, and he and 3 teammates went to a club. And they were waiting in line, and they got to the front of the line, and the bouncer looked at, there were 3 white guys and 1 black guy, and he looked at the black guy and said, "You can't come in here." And they were, because again, they were in Colorado, which is different from North Carolina. And Greg had grown up outside Chicago. And what are you talking about? He can't come in. Well, we don't let blacks in here. So all 4 of them left. And Popovich said he realized that night how white his life had been, that he'd never really, even though he played ball with black guys, he'd never really known black guys. And he made it a point to try to understand. And he told me that he's told his players on different occasions, if I were black, I'd have gone to jail a number of times because of the way police have dealt with him. And Steve, Steve, he's just one of the bright guys out there. He also is a Popovich disciple. And he said that he went on a reading spree to try to understand better what it's like to be black. And that one of his assistant coaches told him that he was watching the news one night after the Ahmaud Arbery shooting, and his 8-year-old son walked in, and he didn't realize he was there. And his son turned to him and said, "Dad, does this mean we can't run in our neighborhood? Because that's how Ahmaud Arbery got murdered." And Steve realized, oh my God, I mean, I've never had to deal with that with my kids. And plus, anybody who's a father, a black father, has to give their kids the talk about dealing with police. And, don't give them an excuse to give you a hard time. And Mike Tomlin told me that he sat his 2 teenage sons down a few years back when they were both getting ready to get driver's licenses and explained this to them. And his older son said, "Oh, come on, Dad, that's not going to happen. This is 2018. It's a different world than what you grew up in Norfolk, Virginia." And Mike just said, "Okay." And 3 times in the first year, his son had a driver's license. He was stopped for DWB. And the first question is always the same. "Where'd you get this car?" Because a black person can't possibly be driving a nice car.
I'm wondering when the officer saw Tomlin on the driver's license, did that change anything?
Apparently because twice it was in their neighborhood. And I guess the cops knew where Mike Tomlin lived in Pittsburgh. But Tony Dungy told me he got stopped in Kansas City driving home late from work one night. Cop just followed him, finally pulled him over and claimed that because he knew the cop was behind him, he was being extra careful. He claimed he had made a right turn on red without stopping. And Tony just said, "Come on, you're just giving me a hard time." And he said, it could have escalated. And the best story about that, best in quotes, was Doc Rivers told me that when the Clippers played in the old LA Sports Arena, they all had to drive through South Central LA to get to the arena. And one afternoon, Kenny Norman, who was on the team, pulled over to get gas. And the next thing he knew, he was across the hood of his car because cops driving by South Central, black guy driving nice car, it had to be stolen.
3 comments from the audience I want to get in here quickly. One says, "Thank you for mentioning Willie Randolph. That situation has always disturbed me." Another one, "I just finished reading your book last month and it's one of the best additions to my sports library."
Thank you.
And this third one of my best friends, when his white friends ask what they can do to help combat systemic racism, always say, "We need your voice. Thank you for using your voice." And I also want to use that to ask, going back a little bit to what you had to say about Popovich and Kerr and their need to listen. They felt they had the need to listen. Is that the solution, a willingness to listen, both from your reporting for this book and your life and life experiences? When we ask, okay, what can change? How can things change? Is it that simple, or is that request that difficult to ask?
Unfortunately, yes, that would be a great solution. Unfortunately, it's a difficult ask. And again, I go back to the 74 million people who voted for Donald Trump. And I'm not saying they're all racist, but Donald Trump is a racist. I mean, you can't argue that if you know his life, if you know his policies, if you know the words he's spoken. And yet all these people still chose to vote for him. And I thank God Joe Biden was elected, but I found that very discouraging that it was as close as it was. But especially after Trump had been in office for 4 years. And if you didn't know who he was before he got into office, you had to know who he was after he got into office. Remember, it was Trump who incited the anthem protests when he gave that rant in Alabama saying, you know what I want to see happen? I want to see if you kneel during our national anthem, the owner says, fire that SOB, fire that son of a bitch. You
and
can't
it really
play.
died down right before that, right? The protests had died down right before that.
The week before that rant, 6 players had knelt. The next week, 200 players either knelt or stayed in the locker room. Mike Tomlin gave his players the option to stay in the locker room if they wanted to. There was one other team that stayed in the locker room.
Did any white players kneel?
Yes, exactly. And it's funny because I was working on a book on playing quarterback in the NFL that year, and Alex Smith was one of the guys I was working with. He was playing for the Chiefs at the time. And he said to me that he felt so bad for his black teammates. He said, if they kneel, they're going to get booed. They're going to be considered unpatriotic. They're going to be considered betrayers of some kind. But if they don't kneel, aren't they betraying their race at this point? When the president has literally challenged them, when Colin Kaepernick is being blackballed. And by the way, I never talked to a player, white or black, who didn't think Colin Kaepernick was blackballed. And Goodell finally basically admitted it a couple of years back, a year and a half ago now. But I think that it's hard for people to understand that just because race doesn't affect your life, because if you're white in this country, there are a lot of people who are completely unaffected by race. And just because it doesn't affect your life doesn't mean it's not an issue. And to say it's not an issue, as Tony Dungy says, people keep saying, why do you make race an issue? Well, because it is. And to say, oh, I don't think it's an issue. Well, you're being either naive or ignorant or just flat out stubborn.
You spoke to John Carlos and Tommy Smith. I'm going to paraphrase this question from the audience here. Do you think that history will look at Colin Kaepernick and Brian Flores in a similar light with the same type of appreciation as we have for them now?
I honestly do. And it's funny because both Tommy Smith and John Carlos told me they believe that about Colin Kaepernick, that it would happen faster for him because things are better now than they used to be.
Got an ESPN documentary coming out, right?
Exactly right. And my guess is, if I don't know, did he talk to him? You might know.
Yeah, he's involved in that project.
Okay. And I think it's actually a Netflix production, and ESPN bought it. So he's being paid for it. So my guess is it'll be fairly sympathetic. But the larger point is that when people do something where they know they're putting themselves in jeopardy, that's what Tommy Smith and John Carlos did. They knew they were putting themselves in jeopardy. So did Peter Norman, excuse me, the Australian who was on the medal podium with them, who wore a button supporting the group that they were a part of, that Harry Edwards had started prior to the Olympics. And he was absolutely pilloried in Australia for that and was an outcast. And only after he died in 2006, Carlos and Smith were both pallbearers, by the way, and both eulogists. In 2012, the Australian Parliament actually formally apologized to his family for the way he had been treated. So they all knew. Colin Kaepernick knew when he sat and then knelt for the anthem that it was going to have consequences. And it ended up costing him his career, as we know. And I don't know, I thought maybe that Roger Goodell would get on a phone to somebody and say, hire Brian Flores right now to try to head off the lawsuit, but it didn't happen. And I think chances are very good Brian Flores will never work in the NFL again. And he's only 40 years old. He should be going into the peak years of his coaching career. Maybe he'll end up as a college coach somewhere, but I think there's a good chance his NFL career is over. And if so, sure, he should be viewed as a martyr, a professional martyr.
What would be interesting is if, with Deion Sanders at Jackson State now and Hugh Jackson at Grambling, Doug Williams coached at Grambling before, will we see these, prominent NFL names coaching at HBCUs, historically Black colleges, in the future? I would keep an eye on that trend as well.
The other thing I would say, if Deion Sanders continues to have the success he had this year at Jackson State, a Power 5 school is going to hire him. Because why wouldn't you hire Deion Sanders if he can coach? And the early evidence is he can coach and he can certainly recruit. So I wrote a column about Deion in December, and I said, I wish my alma mater, Duke, had hired him instead of just another white assistant coach.
I'm trying to think of prime time at Duke.
I think it'd be great.
That's your school, John. Would that work? Would that fit?
I think it would, because look, the kids who go to the basketball games also go to football. Some of them go to football games, not that many because the football team's so bad. I think they would love Deion Sanders, especially if he won. And by the way, I don't know how well you know Deion, but I got to know him very well when I did my book on the Baltimore Ravens in 2004, because he was there. And I'm telling you, he could take over any room he's in. Because he's got that personality, but also because he's so damn smart. Deion
Sanders coaching at Duke would have to be your next book. It would have to be if that happened.
I would be there.
Absolutely. Question here, John, can we find a path to equity in head coaching positions without dealing with the lingering perception that Black athletes are successful because they're bigger, stronger, faster, while white athletes are so often thought to be successful because they play smarter? And John, I would argue that that's an us thing, right? The media, the way we shape the perceptions, it's strictly a matter of that, isn't it?
Yeah, we're all guilty. It's like we were all guilty in the 90s of looking the other way when steroids were taking over baseball. There is definitely that, perception, and there's coding, particularly on TV when people talk about the white point guard who's so cerebral. And the most cerebral point guard I ever knew was Tommy Amaker, who wasn't big, wasn't fast, wasn't quick. All he did was win the game for you.
And now coaches at Harvard.
Which is sort of appropriate, isn't it? And by the way, one of my favorite stories is Tommy. They play MIT every year in their opening game, usually their opening game, because their schools are like a mile apart. And the MIT students come to Harvard, and when the Harvard players are introduced, they chant safety school, which I think is great. But yes, we do need to get past perception. The old saying, perception is reality. Unfortunately, yeah, people believe perception to be reality. And it's like when idiots like what's her name on Fox News, I'm blocking on her name right now, say shut up and dribble. There are people listening to her. And most of the time LeBron James makes sense. He's not always right. None of us are. But the notion that because you play ball or because you're Black or worse, both, you can't have opinions on things. How many times have you, I know it happens to me all the time, people say stick to sports. Well, politics have been a part of sports forever. Go back to the 1936 Olympics and Adolf Hitler, or go back to the first Greek Olympics when the guy was running to Athens and ran a quote a marathon to give news of a war victory. Collapsed and died upon giving the news. That was the first Olympics.
Another question, interesting point, professional teams are privately owned with noticeable exceptions like the Packers. Most universities are state funded. So how is it they were able to get away with these kinds of racial inequities in hiring?
It's a good question. And it's worth noting that most college athletic departments are 501c3s. They're tax exempt. Major League Baseball has, they're exempt from, I'm blocking on the name of the law. You know what I'm talking about. And the NFL is not as much. Antitrust.
Antitrust, yeah.
Antitrust laws. And so you're right. How do they get away with it? And the way they get away with it, unfortunately, is that most boosters of the major schools are white. And I had a friend who's since passed away who went to Duke, loved Duke, and loved all of Duke's black basketball players because they were good, but was absolutely a racist. And he accepted, he was fine with blacks playing for his school and helping his school win, but he didn't want any of them over to dinner. And, that's true of a lot of fans and alumni of these schools. And I know I'm overgeneralizing, but a lot of people who will defend athletes from their school, black or white, also don't want to have the black athletes to their house for dinner, and probably in many cases don't want a black person coaching their teams or their players.
And I've been thinking recently about a conversation I had with Peter Guber, who's a movie producer, co-owner of the Warriors and the LA Dodgers. And, he always talks about tribalism and that we associate with different tribes. And he doesn't consider that a bad thing. It's a natural instinct. You can't necessarily say that when we look at the lack of diversity in coaching, it's not necessarily racism. It's tribalism in that people are going to hire people that they're comfortable with, that make them feel comfortable, right? They're going to gravitate toward that. I would say the racism comes into play is like, why have they lived such segregated lives when they haven't been around Black people or people of different races in order to be more comfortable? But, so the racism comes into play in that we're segregated. And then the tribalism comes into play in that you're not exposed to different people. And when it's time to hire, you only feel comfortable with certain people. But we can't legislate hiring. We don't want to force hiring. They can force interviews, but it has to stop short of mandating you hire people based on race.
Right.
And so therefore, if we can't do that, how do you make people comfortable if they're coming from a society that's segregated?
Well, that's the catch-22 question. And I think most of those making these hires would be shocked if you said to them that they've acted, that they're racist, that they've acted in a way that's racist. I don't think Mike Shanahan is a racist. But I do think that without thinking about it, he resorted to racial coding in the Donovan McNabb situation. He probably, if somebody pointed it out to him, he probably would have said, "Oh my God, that's not what I meant." Well, except that's what came out. And that's the way he was thinking. And I think, I know people who well, the perfect example, John Gruden. After his emails, he said, "There's not a racist bone in my body." Well, of course there is. But I think he honestly believes there's not. And I think that's true of many people who would say, "Oh, I'm not a racist at all." I had a friend who worked on the PGA Golf Tour for many years. And we used to argue all the time about the fact that I believed he was a racist. And this is somebody who's a friend of mine. And I'm not a racist at all. Jim Thorpe, this guy had played on the tour. Jim Thorpe was one of my best friends when I played on the tour. Okay, what would you do, I asked, if your daughter came to the front door and introduced you to her Black boyfriend? And he looked at me and he said, "Honestly, I'd go get my shotgun."
Wow.
At least he was honest.
Wow.
But, there are certain tests and there are certain levels. And actually hiring somebody rather than just interviewing them, because the rules say you have to interview someone, are two completely different levels. And I give Dan Rooney credit because he had already met his Rooney Rule obligation by interviewing Ron Rivera the year he hired Mike Tomlin. And Tomlin just blew him away, as he put it. But the other interesting thing is Ron Rivera, who basically grew up in California, is considered a minority, and Robert Salah is considered a minority because he's Muslim. And I asked Brian McCarthy of the NFL, I said, so when Marv Levy and Sid Gilman were coaching, were they considered minorities because they're Jewish? And he said, no, they're not. So I don't know how they draw those lines. I mean, and the bottom line is that, like you said, 70% of the league's black, and we now have 2 black coaches and 1 mixed race coach.
My final question, I will say my personal favorite of all your books is Good Walk Spoiled. I read that on the way to covering my first British Open. Really took me into the world of golf and a lot of the history of it as well. Why hasn't Tiger Woods led to a explosion or a greater wave of black golfers? We're 25 years past his Masters win now. Why hasn't that happened?
Well, when Tiger won the Masters in 1997, a lot of money started pouring into the first tee. And I think we all thought that we were going to see a lot more, not Tiger Woods, but very good PGA Tour level black players. The first tee has produced 1 player on the PGA Tour, and he is a minority, Scott Langley. He's left-handed. But not 1 black player. I guess the NFL would consider that a minority. And I think some of it has to do with Tiger. It's not like Tiger is out there, he has his foundation and that's great, but it's not like he's aggressively out there trying to say, hey, look at me, try to grow up to be like me. Tiger's, his yacht is named Privacy. That says all you need to know about who he is. And I also, Harold Varner III, who's completely the opposite of Tiger as a personality. He's outgoing, he's friendly, just won a tournament overseas. But Harold, who's been involved with the first tee in North Carolina, where he grew up, says the first tee isn't about golf. It's enough. It's about, it's daycare at a golf course. And what Harold has suggested is they need more programs in golf like the one he grew up in. He got to play at a municipal course in Gastonia, North Carolina. His dad paid $100 for the summer, and he got to play Monday through Friday. We need more of that in golf, not so much people saying, okay, learn the rules, learn the etiquette, as go out and play. That's the way you get good. You go out and play.
Awesome. Steve, did you want to join us here?
John, as somebody who's, been able to share dinner and conversation in which you've held court, I knew an hour was vastly insufficient. This has been terrific. And Jay, both of you guys, I can't thank you enough for, being with us tonight. I do wish we had 2 hours to do this. But I suspect we'll be talking, I know we'll be talking about these issues, well beyond tonight, well beyond Sunday, probably well beyond when we're doing what we're doing. But for those of you out there, John's book again is Raise a Fist, Take a Knee, Race and the Illusion of Progress in Modern Sports. And as always, we encourage you to buy it at your local independent bookstore or on bookshop.org, which supports independent bookstores across the country. John, thank you again so much. Jay, thank you again so much. And I want to thank all of you as well from the Kansas City Public Library.
Thank you, John, so much for your time, for your work.